Philippians 4:13, one of the most classic, most quoted verses in all of Christianity and kind of even in the world when it comes to famous quotes. And that says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or other translations say, through Christ who gives me strength. And we usually see that showing up in particular contexts. And I personally think because of that, it's grossly distorted to what really the Apostle Paul, when he wrote that to the Philippians 2,000 years ago, what he was meaning. Because the context we use it in, and you probably have seen it today too, is either an athlete or some famous figure. Before they go into something they really need success in, they quote that and say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And what they're really saying is, well, I'm going to win this, or I'm going to get success because I have Jesus. Almost if Jesus is some genie that they can kind of just rub the lamp and he's got to show up at the championship game, right? And they can do all things because of him. Now, there might be some truth in there, but I think there's a lot of distortion, and it really comes down to context. So we use that verse as saying, before an event happens or before something happens, we say, hey, I can do this because of Jesus, right? I remember being at a Christian university, and before you take a final or, a test at midterms, people would say, oh, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And it's like, well, yeah, but did you study? Because that might help as well, right? And so there's some nuances there we have to look at, and it's not necessarily a precursor before we go into an event, but the context not only meant probably the exact opposite, but it's actually Paul saying it after something happened, right? So not before, but it's actually him saying it after as an encouragement and a truth on top of that. And so let's look at the verse before that and see if that gives us an entirely different meaning. And just to give you some history, this was written 2,000 years ago, roughly, and it's almost like us reading someone else's mail. It was a letter Paul wrote to the Philippians, the church at Philippi, and he was in jail at the time, prison. And I doubt prison in that time was similar to our American culture prison. So just let that sink in too with this text. And so in verse 12, he says this, before the famous 13. He says, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and of hunger, abundance and of need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So what is Paul saying there? He's not saying, oh, I'm going into this championship game, or I'm going into this thing and I can do it because of Jesus. He's actually saying, hey, I'm in prison. Hey, I actually have been beat up. I have been shipwrecked. I have been hungry. I've been in need. But because Jesus sustains me, Jesus is my identity, I am satisfied in him, I can get through this. So rather it being about successes, it's almost about failures. Paul's saying, I don't know what's coming next because I have been hungry and I've also been fed. I've had a lot of money. I've had a little money, but it doesn't matter. Those don't define me. Those aren't my identity because Jesus is my strength. And so when you let that sink in, it's almost a verse rather about, if you take the sports example again, it's almost less about you succeeding in the championship game or in the boxing ring, and it actually should be an encouragement to you when you lose. When something happens that you don't think should have happened, or when it goes wrong, or when it goes bad, or when you're poor, or when you're hungry, or when you're struggling, you say, hey, I can get through this because my identity is in Jesus. He gives me strength. So be encouraged with that in this text, in this verse. It's a simple truth, but let's be careful that we don't twist it into almost turning Jesus into our puppet. He's not. He's God, he's Lord, he's King, and that's good news. And I think the last thing that I realized when I was kind of thinking about this video is our biggest problem arises is we turn this book into a fortune cookie. We open it up. Sometimes even people kind of do this blind thing where they just put their finger, and we want it to be one sentence, kind of like the horoscopes or kind of like the fortune cookies that just gives us our little thing that fits into our life. But that's totally kind of cutting this book off at the knees. This is a beautiful book, actually consisting of 66 books over thousands of years by, I think, 30 plus different authors. There's poetry, there's art, there's literature, there's history, there's music, there's narrative. And when you let the book stand like that with its different pieces and its different pillars and breathe truth into your life, then it is beautiful. I mean, the verses and the numbers weren't even added till hundreds of years after it was written, right? So I think it would be best for us to stop reading the tweet-sized Bible verses, but say, hey, what's the story? Who is it to? Who is it from? What do I think he's trying to get the hearers to understand? And then when you get in that realm, the Bible starts to come alive, starts to give you life and truth, and starts to be a thing that you want to turn to more often. So be encouraged. Love you guys.